All right, we have done some cool stuff thus far. We are pulling live SharePoint list data into the chart.js chart visualization and displaying that data within a web part in our SharePoint framework application. In this lesson, we're going to take a closer look at the way we have set up this chart component, and we're actually going to change it so it's a lot more extensible and editable so that we can actually control its appearance, control what fields and what lists we're using, all using the web part property pane. So whenever we come in and we edit this, we want to be able to control all the different properties that are going to make up how the chart is actually visualized itself to make this a really extensible, really reusable web part that's going to be applicable in a lot of different places. So first of all, what we're going to need to do in order to accommodate this is to create several new web part properties that are going to allow us as content authors to control what we see inside the web part. So for that, we need to switch over to Visual Studio Code, and in our -webpart.ts, our web part entry file, we can go down here and find our -webpart props interface that is describing the web part properties of this web part. And as with all new web parts that you create in SharePoint Framework, you're going to get the default one, which is just description, which we don't actually need in this case. So we're going to go ahead and delete that, and we're going to create several new web part properties here and then create controls for them in our property pane down below. So first of all, we're going to need to be able to select the list in this of the data that we want to display in the chart. So we're going to add a list ID property of type string. We also want to be able to provide the selected fields, which is going to be a string. So that's going to have kind of a comma separated field list. We're going to have a chart type, which is going to be a string as well. That's going to define whether we want a line chart or a bar chart or whatever. We're going to have a chart title, which will also be a string. That's going to define what appears as a title, if anything, over the chart itself. And finally, we're going to have our colors. So these are going to be the fill colors or the line colors for our bar and line charts, respectively. And so for now, let's just set up color 1, which is going to be a string, and then we'll also have color 2 and color 3. We'll talk about a way to make this even more extensible in a future lesson, but for now, let's just add 3 color controls, and we'll do kind of the same thing we're doing now, where you'll go through and you'll use the first color, second color, third color, and then you'll loop back around to the first color. Cool, so now that these are created, let's set up multiple cursors and we'll copy all of those. Then we can open up the second place we need to go to for our web part properties, which is going to be adding default values in the web part manifest file. And as always, we're going to go down here to our pre-configured entries and the properties object. We'll delete the description here and we'll add each of those web part properties we created in the interface. And for each one of these, we want to set a default value of a string. Will be fine for now. And I do want a default value of the chart type to default to a bar chart. And let's give it some default colors as well. So again, I'll paste in those colors that we had used before. We can actually copy those from chart here. So let's grab 3 of these colors and we'll just paste those into the manifest there. Great, so I think that'll do it for the manifest. Let's save this and close this file. And now we're going to need to create some controls for all these new properties that we have created. So let's go all the way to the bottom of this file to our get property pane configuration method. And we need to set a control for each of those new properties that we just created. Let's update our header description to be -settings. We'll have a group for the chart data. So this will be where you can define things like the list and the fields that you've selected. So let's just, for now, we'll add a text field for list ID will be our target property. And then this label will just be list. And let's also add a text field for selected fields. And this label will be selected fields. Let's add another group down below this for the chart settings. And this will have some group fields, which include, let's add a drop down here for the chart type, first of all. That's going to be property pane drop down. And that's going to be imported at the top. And the target property for this will be chart type. And this is going to require a label of chart type. That'll be the display name for this dropdown. And then it's also going to need an array of options. And the options, once again, are an array of this iProperty pane dropdown option. And basically all that means is it's an object with both some sort of key as well as some sort of text. And so what we'll do is we'll create a bar chart. And let's create several of these because I know we had, I think it was called bar horizontal. We also had a line chart. And what else did I import into the file at the top here? We have pie and donut as well. So let's copy these. And we will paste those in here as well as right here. Great. And then after our dropdown, we want a property pane text field for our chart title property. So that's going to allow you to do the chart title. And this will need a label of chart title. Cool. So that's looking pretty good so far. Let's create yet another group here. The very last one is going to be for our colors. So this will be group name chart style. And this will have a group fields array as well. And within here, we will have our color controls. So we've added a color picker before. Let's go ahead and open up that PNP property controls package that we had used in a previous lesson. And we're going to follow the same npm install stuff that we've done before. So I'm just going to copy this command. We'll jump into Hyper. We'll stop our local workbench and install these controls. Great, so let's run gulp serve once again to start up our local workbench. And we'll close the old one and drag this one over. Great. So in our property controls, let's go to the controls one here, and we know we want a color picker in this case. So let's just scroll down here, and just like we did before, we'll copy the import that you see here. So let's jump back into Visual Studio Code, and up at the top, let's import the color picker like so. And now that we have that imported, we can copy our actual color picker code, which is right here. So I'm going to hit copy right there. We'll jump to the bottom of our file, and we will paste that in. Now here, the target property should be color1. And this should be this.properties.color1. And just as before, I like to change the color picker style to .inline, so it takes up a little bit less space. And I'm not sure what the key is, but we should probably change this to something like color picker 1. I think that might have to be unique. I'm not really sure. But now let's duplicate this twice. And then on this one, we will change 1 to 2. And we'll change 1 down here to 3. We should probably also put a number as the label so we can tell which one we're picking. All right, cool. So that's looking pretty good. Let's, before we can get this working, we do have an error in this file. You'll see here, we're trying to access this.properties.description, which no longer exists. So let's just, for now, to fix this, let's put in an empty string there so that at the very least, this will compile, hopefully, and we'll get a new web part that appears. There it goes. And let's go ahead and hit the Edit Web Part button, and you'll see all the new controls that we just added to this web part. It's looking good. Now, you'll notice sometimes that your default values don't actually get loaded in. So you see, I don't have a default color. To be honest, I'm not really sure why that works. Sometimes if you delete the web part and you add it again, you'll get the default value. So I'm not really sure. It might just be that I had done that too soon after the local workbench started up, but whatever, just delete the web part and re-add it if you don't see your default values there. But you do in fact have a default value for our colors as well as our default bar chart that you'll see there. So I can choose bar chart, I can type in a chart title, whatever you want there. We have our color pickers, which of course are functional, and everything is working swimmingly. So the next thing we'll do is we need to pass all of these properties down to our chart component. And in order to do that, we're going to need to add this, first of all, to our dash properties, the props for our dash component. So let's open this up. Let's delete description. And we want all of the properties that we had added here. So let's copy all of these. It's basically going to be the exact same interface, except with the colors. Let's just set a colors string array. That'll kind of simplify it once it gets down to this point. And likewise, let's set selected fields to be an array. And this is just to kind of demonstrate that you don't always need to use exactly the property that's in your web part itself. You can kind of do some manipulation of these to send it in a friendlier format, if you will. And I think it's going to be easier to work with selected fields as an array and also with colors as an array. And the way we'll get that to work is in our dash web part here, when we're passing our props down to this dash component, we can add each one of these things up here. So let's copy all those. And let me add an empty string and a comma on each of those. But for example, with the colors, we can wrap that up into an array, which will equal this dot properties dot color1, color2, and color3. So we're actually creating an array as we're passing this down, which makes this a little bit easier to work with once you get down to your React components. And sometimes that's something I prefer doing. So selected fields also needs to be an array. So we basically need to take our selected fields and say this dot properties dot selected fields dot split on a comma. So we'll take whatever input you put into the selected fields text box and we'll split it, which will return a new array that's going to split on the comma. And all these other ones will just take this dot properties dot, and then it'll be dot list ID, chart type, and title. So those will just get passed down one for one. Okay, cool. So now that we've done that in our React Dev Tools, if we switch over to those, you'll notice our dash component now has those props that we've passed down to it. So it has the colors, it has all of the selected fields, and the colors are actually sent down as an array. And you'll see here, as I update the first color, you'll see that flash of yellow as it gets updated down here, which is looking great. Same thing with selected fields. I could say field 1, field 2, and you see it's actually splitting that out into an array just based on where I put the commas, which is looking pretty good at this point. Cool, so we need to in turn pass these props down to the chart component. Because if you remember, we have our dash component, which is creating the chart component, but then the chart component actually is what needs all of these props. So in our chart component, let's open that up, and in our props interface, let's basically just paste all these in because it's going to be the exact same props in this case. So now this is expecting all of these props that we have on the dash component. And then within here, we can, on a new line, we will paste each of these props. So we'll paste these. And then on each of these, we will say equals this dot props dot, and then we'll paste that in again. So it'll just kind of pass through all of its props, including the list ID, selected fields, etc. Cool. So now what we should see, hopefully, is when this refreshes in our React Dev Tools down here, our chart component has all the same props that are tied all the way up to our web part property controls, which is looking great. And now what's left is to actually put these controls to use. So for example, if we want to change the chart type based on what's selected on the right, we could go into our chart component and we could simply update our render method to change what it's charting based on the value of chart type. So for example, I could say this.props.chart type is equal to bar, then go ahead and output a bar chart. And we could do that for all the different options. Let me go up here and just make sure I have all the right options here. Let's copy those. And then down here, we will just change each of these to that. And then of course this will go there. So we'll be able to change the chart type based on what you select. And then as we refresh here, let's go ahead and load in some data. And then all we have to do is hit edit. We can choose bar horizontal and whoops, bar horizontal. So that's, I had that flipped around, which is why that didn't work. So it actually needs to be horizontal bar, it looks like. So let's go into our dash web part down here at the bottom. And let's change that to horizontal bar. That should fix that issue. Okay, so let's give this a refresh. Let's edit this, and we'll need to change the chart type back to bar. Let's refresh. Now if we get a horizontal bar, we get a horizontal bar chart. We get a line chart, pie chart, etc. Very cool. We can update our chart title already. That's already outputting as an H1 inside of the render method, which is looking good. And let's also add our colors to our logic in the chart web part as well. So down in our chart data method, previously we were hard coding this colors array. So let's take that out entirely. And everywhere we're using that, we will instead replace it with this dot props dot colors. And now the colors in our web part are going to be tied to whatever is entered in the web part property pane. So we can hit refresh. It's going to load in those very greenish colors that we have. And if we want to add some blue here, you'll see it's going to update that in real time, which is pretty cool. So the very last thing we're going to have to do is wire up the list and selected fields. Currently, these don't do anything. When you type it in, we've still hard-coded those values. So what we'll try now is we're going to replace all those hard-coded instances where we are retrieving this one list and retrieving these predefined columns with a more dynamic approach where we can paste in or type in the list ID here and add the fields we want to select and have all that data show up right inside of the chart. And first there's the list itself, which is the list ID. That's fairly easy to update. So let's do that one first. Let's go up in our get list items method. We will copy this list ID. We'll paste it into the web part itself over here. And then we will simply replace get list items with this .props .list ID. And then now as we save this, let's give this a refresh in our remote workbench. And hopefully we'll still see the data show up there because we're tied to that list ID. And now we have our selected fields. This one's going to be a little bit more difficult because the way that we have to build our chart data object is, first of all, we need to decide what's on the x-axis, what's going to be a label on each data set, and then what's going to be data in each data set. So we kind of need to figure out how just selecting fields is going to map to these various areas. There's actually 3 different places that we're placing our columns in this case. And what I propose that we do is inside of our selected fields, the first field that you select will always become the series name. So for example, if I selected title and then earnings Q1 as my fields, the title would become the series name for each data set, and then earnings Q1 becomes the first x-axis that you see here. And then the value of that is what is plotted on the y-axis. And by using this same format, we can basically allow the user, when they're adding this dash web part to any page, to choose what is going to be their series labels and how many options we're going to plot along the x-axis just by selecting additional fields like earnings Q2, etc. So what we'll do in our get chart data method, or chart data method rather, we need to update this to not have any hard-coded values, first of all. So let's go ahead and delete anywhere where we're hard-coding this. And we'll just simply bring this back to a very simple empty string for the label, an empty data array inside of our data set, and an empty labels array up here. Cool. And with that done, we now need to iterate over our selected fields in order to properly build out our labels array as well as our data set label and data itself. So down here within this this.state.items.map, we'll add an iterator to build the data set. And this will iterate over this.props.selected fields. And we'll map over that. And so for each field, and let's add a counter just in case we need it, called J. And first of all, we'll get the value. So const value of this field on this item is going to be item of field, like so. So let's put a comment here, get the value. And now we need to make sure that we properly build out our labels array. And the labels array need to equal, in this case, we have selected earnings Q1 and earnings Q2, and the labels along the x-axis need to say the same thing. It would be earnings Q1 and earnings Q2 in this case. So what we can do is we can say if this is the first item, or if I is equal to 0, then let's go ahead and add labels. So that'll be data.labels.push field. So it's actually going to push the field name. So along the x-axis, it's going to say earnings Q1 and earnings Q2. So that's going to take care of the labels on our chart data. We also need to make sure we build out the label and the data array on the data set itself. And what we'll do is if this is the first field, so if J is equal to 0, then we'll set our data set label to that value. Otherwise, set the data array. Let's go ahead and push the value into that array. So that's going to be if J is equal to 0, then dataset.label is equal to value, which we got from up here, else dataset.data.push value, like so. And hopefully, I think that's everything we need to do. Let's test this out in our remote workbench. We will give this an edit to make sure we have those selected. Let's give this a refresh. And then we have our title being added as a label here. So that's not right. So let's fix that over here. We only need to add the label if this is the first item and if J is greater than 0, because we only need to add a label on earnings Q1 and earnings Q2, where the field index is going to be not the first item. So let's give that a shot. We'll give this a quick refresh in our remote workbench. We'll hit edit and refresh. And there we go. That looks much better. So what's really cool about this is I can now change this to earnings Q2, and then it's going to drop that data in right over there on the right automatically. So now the user is in total control over what actually gets displayed and even in what order, like so. So one other little tidbit that you may run into, if this doesn't work for you, if for some reason your value is not set, there is kind of a weird fringe case in SharePoint that I've run into in the past where the field name could actually not be correct. There's some case where if like you create the field using the little plus icon on the field view instead of going into the list settings and creating it there, it may have a weird format where the field name is actually something like this, where it says OData underscore field, like that. Like that would be the actual format of the internal field name, even though you may think it's earnings Q1, it would actually be OData underscore. So just a weird thing that may or may not happen depending on how your columns were created on your list. So we can just add a quick check in here to kind of handle that just in case to make this a little bit more error-free. So what we'll do is we'll just simply say if value is equal to undefined and item of OData underscore field is not equal to undefined, then we'll go ahead and set value is equal to this right here. And we're reassigning values, so we'll need to make that a let. And that's going to work just the same, because I think in our case this is not actually an issue, but just to double check, let's make sure this still works inside of our remote workbench. We'll click on refresh and we're still good to go. Okay, cool. So one other issue you may run into whenever you are using a line chart, you can't see all your data, and that's certainly not ideal. So one thing we can do now that we're dynamically controlling the chart type, what we'll do down here in our where we're building our data set out, before we push our data set onto the data sets array, we'll just add a little line chart section to check for this, and we can say this.props if this.props.chart type is equal to line. Let's go ahead and set data set of fill is equal to false. That's just going to set the fill property to false, so that whenever you have a line chart, as you'll see here, we'll give it a refresh. And we'll pull in our data. It's actually not going to fill based on that, which is looking a little bit better. If we switch back to a bar chart, it will actually apply the fill in that case. Great. All right, that's going to do it for this lesson. We have created a really extensible, really configurable web part at this point, which is looking quite good. The user has quite a bit of control over it, but we can certainly make additional improvements. In particular, it's not very user-friendly to have to paste in a list ID, which is not very apparent for any user that's using this web part. Also, to have to select the fields by entering in a comma-separated string into this text box is probably not the best way we could handle field selection. So let's think about some better ways to handle that in the next lesson.